It's Friday, August 22nd, 2025. I'm Albert Mohler, and this is The Briefing, a daily analysis of news and events from a Christian worldview. Well, we are told America has a boy crisis. You probably knew that already. The lead on the Sunday opinion page of the New York Times just this week says, lonely, detached, and isolated, today's young men are adrift. We faced this problem a century ago. We can solve the boy crisis again. Two major intellectual figures are producing this, Robert D. Putnam and Richard V. Reeves, and both of them are pretty well known. Reeves has been leading into this space for some time. Robert Putnam, of course, has been very, very famous for theories such as the problem in America of bowling alone, the loss of social capital. Both of them are serious figures, and I think they're right. There's a serious problem here. And the New York Times, interestingly, in its own archives, has all the evidence you need about what it refers to here as a boy crisis of 100 years ago, or the boy crisis of the last century. And so what was that? What are we talking about? Well, if you go back to the late 19th century, the early 20th century, especially in America's big cities, you had a boy problem. And that was also preceded and accompanied by developments in European cities elsewhere, where you had industrialization, you had so many people moving into the cities, you had fathers working in factories, and largely out of the home during the day. You had boys on the streets, and boys by the thousands and the thousands and the thousands, and guess what? You had a problem. You had social pathologies, you had juvenile delinquency, you had boys falling behind, you had a lot of boys staying out of school. The response of the United States at the time was to really increase the importance of public schooling, and this is where you also get a lot of mandatory attendance laws in terms of policies for kids, such that it was breaking the law not to be in school. And of course, this led to all kinds of, fictional accounts of boys who were truants and all the rest. And but there was also an effort to try to build social capital. And it's not even clear that that term was accessible then, but they did have the notion that you couldn't just say, hey, don't do that anymore. You would have to say, okay, here, do something productive, do something that will build social capital. And so you had the emergence of the YMCA, the Young Men's Christian Association, and the rise of the Boy Scouts in popularity. One of the things that this article makes clear and documents is that in a relatively short amount of time, so many of these organizations came into being. And they did. It wasn't a coincidence. Trying to build social capital, try to build a new boyhood culture, and a new social expectation of what it meant to grow from a boy into a youth, as was the term used then, and then into a young man and successful manhood. Okay, now here's what is the common concern now. And so the New York Times, which is, again, declaring that there is now a boy crisis, is looking at statistics we just can't ignore anymore. Boys are falling behind in terms of academic aptitude, in terms of schooling. They're falling way behind girls. They're showing up in smaller numbers where they should be showing up in big numbers. They're failing to show up when it comes, for instance, to college admissions, where it's incredibly lopsided now when you look at the preponderance of young women entering colleges rather than young men. Boys are falling behind. They're falling behind in social skills. They're falling behind vocationally as well. This particular article says that if you take young men up to about age 25, about 10% of them are neither in school or at work. That's an incredibly large number. And these statistics, these pathologies, and you have to refer to them as pathologies, these are problems. The New York Times didn't run this because they want to say there's not a problem. They recognize there is a problem. They're calling it, again, the boy crisis, saying we can solve it again. And in this case, Robert D. Putnam and Richard V. Reeves are suggesting more or less that the answer to this is building social capital. Once again, building social capital that involves boys, will socialize boys, turn their energies and interests into something culturally productive, and try to recover lost ground. And of course, a lot of the pathologies here are really dark. You're talking about juvenile delinquency, you're talking about juvenile crime, you're talking about, in many ways, a lot of boys moving out of the cultural mainstream before they, frankly, even really get into it. You're also talking about, of course, academic issues, aptitude, work ethic. And one of the saddest things in this article is how much time boys, at least according to many reports, say of themselves that they're lonely. They experience a lot of loneliness. I want to say, I think a contributing factor to that, by the way, is the prevalence of modern technology, uh, which gives boys the opportunity. I mean, all children, frankly, and men as well as boys, by the way, the opportunity to just check out and go into a virtual world, video games, internet, and all the rest. And one of the big problems here, of course, is that you're looking at the fact that boys and girls are different, men and women are different, and so the temptations are different, the patterns are different. To put it more scientifically, the pathologies are different. But the fact is that girls are doing better. And of course, one of the interesting things about this article is that even as the New York Times says, we can solve the boy crisis again. And this isn't the first time the New York Times or major media have conceded the problem. The interesting thing is that they have to, right now, in this political context, in this cultural moment, they have to come back and say, but this doesn't mean that we need to do something special for boys we're not doing for girls. It's an egalitarianism that increasingly is female tilted. And so there's the open accusation. You've seen feminists make this argument for years that if you do something special for boys, even if you have organizations just for boys, that's discrimination. And yet the fact is that no human society has really found a way to grow boys into manhood without two things. And the first of them is men, and in particular, fathers. And then beyond that, a structure of male-defined spaces where they learn from older men and in the company of other boys how they actually move forward into adulthood and maturity. And, for a long time, you even had a lot of social psychologists and others who just want to deny there's a basic difference between boys and girls. And even today, there are some who want to say it's all environmental. It's all by social expectation. Parents treat boys differently than girls, and thus they have different interests, aptitudes than girls. But there's nothing native, natural, But frankly, that just doesn't work. That just doesn't work. And I've often mentioned a study that I found just really illuminating years ago, in which you had two 13-year-old boys and two 13-year-old girls. And the scientists just created a room. They had two chairs randomly arranged, and they put two 13-year-old girls who don't know each other in the room. They put the chairs facing each other. The girls locked on and had nonstop conversation for the entire length of the experiment. Okay. You put two 13-year-old boys in the room with the random chairs. They put the chairs side by side like they're pilots and co-pilots on an airplane. They're staring out an invisible windshield. They don't look each other in the eye. Not a lot of eye contact. Girls immediately lock on the eye contact. Boys, not so much the eye contact. And let's just say the conversational space is different. Lots of empty spaces. I don't know. What do you know? It's just very, very different. You want to see how different it is? Go to the emergency room. How many of the kids waiting for treatment in the emergency room are girls who are in trouble because they said, hey guys, watch this? It's a completely different dynamic. And this is something that successful civilizations have understood. And by the way, it's a part of what we have to come back to time and time again is creation order. Now, of course, that can be exaggerated. It can be contorted and corrupted. But frankly, it has to be respected. And any successful civilization understands that. One of the figures that has been very influential on me thinking about this is a Russian sociologist, Pitarim Sorokin. And years ago, he made the observation, he said, there's not one civilization that has had a girl crisis, but every single civilization has a boy crisis. He says there isn't a single civilizational moment in history when a civilization had trouble with girls going into womanhood. He says, but virtually every civilization has had a crisis turning boys into manhood. And I think there's something biblical about that. I think we just understand that men and women are different, boys and girls are different, the challenges are different. But here's the big thing. You take this big front page opinion section article in the New York Times, and I think it does a pretty good job of laying out the problem. I think it does a pretty good job of acknowledging there is a problem. I think the historical parts of it are pretty accurate. I've given a lot of attention to this in my own work. The boy crisis of the early 20th century, the rise of all these organizations. But I'll just simply note that it's the cultural powers that be that have basically torn all these things down. It's the cultural left that has subverted virtually all of these organizations. And it was cultural pressure upon the Boy Scouts to stop being the Boy Scouts and just become the Scouts. And the interesting thing is that this article makes clear that in a lot of spaces that have been dominated by boys, they're now not equal. They're dominated by girls. And so, or young women. It's not just the college campus in so many ways. It is also certain professions. It is also Even in sports, becoming a differential. The rise of the number of girls in organized sports has come with a decline in the number of boys in organized sports and a disproportionate ratio. Now, I'm not saying there's cause and effect. I'm simply saying as a society, we're doing something wrong. Something is broken, and we're going to have to fix it. And I want to tell you what I think is missing in this article. So Robert D. Putnam and Richard V. Reeves, again, well-known figures in American intellectual life. They're not at all from the far left. I think they're kind of from the center left is where I would describe them. But both of them are pretty well-credentialed members of the cultural elite. They're both people who will show up, in all the right places, cited by all the right people. And let me tell you what is not in this article. And again, it's in the New York Times. What's not here is any clear acknowledgement that what's missing in the picture is dad. Because it's politically impossible for people in this space to say, creation order not only tells us there's a difference between men and women and boys and girls. Creation order also tells us that God's intention was that there be a mother and a father in the home. And all the way from the beginning, it has been clear that there are circumstances in which there's not a mother and a father in the home, one or the other. And more often than not, it's the father who's missing. And there were a lot of reasons for that had to do with everything from warfare in the workplace to just different patterns among men and women. But the fact is, Piturim Sorokin would show up again to say, one of the first tasks of a civilization is to create a context in which men have to get married and have to function as husbands and fathers in order to have standing in society, in order for the society to work. Again, it's a disproportionate energy in pushing males in that direction as compared to females. But let's face it, we have had a subversion of marriage, a subversion of the family. We've had a subversion of fatherhood. I mean, honestly, we've had generations of gender feminists who have argued that being male is the problem. And frankly, that we need to subvert the patriarchy, all over. But you know what? Where you have a boy in the picture, you pretty much need a patriarchy. But that's just the way it works. Interestingly, I'm going to cite the fact that the same paper, just about a few weeks ago, ran an article by Claire Cain Miller. So again, it's the same newspaper. It's a vast newspaper. So I'm not saying that people in the newspaper talked about the fact that both of these articles appeared, but it is interesting. The New York Times itself ran an article back in July. Here's the headline: "Shaped by Women, Boys Feel Dearth, that is a lack of strong male mentors." Now, let me just say that the fact that that's a news story tells us a whole lot about the world in which we live. The fact that it takes journalists to point that out, and that's considered interesting enough that it would be a headline in a news article. You take that apart, you realize, wow, we are well downstream from the problem. But the point I want to make is that as much as I agree with the writers here, with Putnam and with Reeves about so much of the problem they describe, I want to say I don't think there's any recovery without recovering a biblical understanding of marriage, a biblical understanding of family, an understanding of the distinctive and vital roles of fathers and mothers, of husbands and wives, and of the context of the family as the principal context in which this battle is going to be won or lost. I want to be very clear. It's not the only context in which this battle is won or lost. But I do want to say this. A society thinks that you can subvert the family, subvert parenthood. You can subvert marriage as the union of a mother and father, and the expectation that the mother and the father will remain married. I guess you used to say first, get married, be married, stay married, and raise their children together. When you subvert that, no number of organizations you create on the other side is going to come close to meeting the problem. While I'm on it, I'll just say also, just in recent days, the New York Times had another front page article, this one with a headline, due to some of the big headline news right now concerning President Trump and Washington, D.C., and law enforcement and all the rest. Front page, juvenile crime, a D.C., that's District of Columbia, concern for many years. Front page article. Again, lots of interesting stuff in it. Let me tell you what's really not in it is an acknowledgement of the fact that if you take the gender breakdown of this problem, it's not 50-50. It's not close. And any successful civilization understands what it's got to do to address this kind of issue. The problem is our powers that be don't even want to touch the truth, and they want to subvert it and stay away from it as far as possible. Okay, now we're going to turn to questions, and once again, I just have to say, I'm astounded by the questions that are sent in. They're just really intelligent. They're right on target and make us all think. So I want to turn to the first one. It's coming from a 16-year-old young man who is writing a senior thesis at school, and he's asking the question, is it possible to support capital punishment and fight against abortion in the United States from an ethical and theological standpoint? Okay, well, I'm not going to give you enough for your senior thesis, but I hope to push you a little bit forward on this. I want to tell you, yes, I believe you can make that case and should make that case, and I'm thankful that a young man is taking this on as the case to make. That's very encouraging to me. So how do we think about this? Is it possible, is the question, to support capital punishment and to oppose abortion, basically, and to seek both of those to be honored in the law and reflected in the law? I want to say, yes, it is. And I think a part of the reason why we need to understand this is because I think many Christians misconstrue capital punishment in terms of the biblical understanding. So the biblical understanding is actually very, very clear. And I think we could look at the entire Scripture, and in particular the Old Testament, where the capital punishment is mandated in many recitations of the law in different contexts. But the most important thing is to understand premeditated murder. And the key text for understanding that is Genesis chapter 9, where in the Noahic covenant, that's the covenant that God made with Noah after the flood, we read this, quote, "And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man. From his fellow man I will require a reckoning for the life of man." And then in verse 6 of Genesis chapter 9, "Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." And so there's a distinction here. There's a distinction between killing an animal and killing a human being. And that has to do with the fact the human being is made in God's image. And thus the logic in the law that was given here and the strictures of the covenant that God made with Noah, handed to Noah, revealed to Noah, it has to do with the fact that the image of God makes humanity distinct from every other living creature. And thus homicide is different than any other form of killing. And it comes with a consequence. And the biblical logic is this. If you intentionally take a man's life, you forfeit your own, in order to make very clear what is at stake. The way to preserve, protect, respect the dignity of every single human life is to understand that premeditated murder is one thing that simply can't possibly be accepted. It requires the society's strongest, clearest sanction. It is taking life in such a way you forfeit your own. And, we live in a fallen world, and that means that every legal system is imperfect. And that's one of the reasons why, when you look at something like capital punishment, number one, it needs to be legally mandated. That is to say, it's not just some kind of mob action. It's within a legal structure, the rule of law. Secondly, it needs to be specified for certain crimes. And I would say premeditated murder is at the top of that list, and generally has been. If there's any consensus on the issue, and I think this is rooted in the natural law, premeditated murder is the one thing. And that's clearly what's implied here in the Noahic covenant in Genesis chapter 9. And I think the third thing, every society that honors the rule of law has to get to, and that is there has to be enormous protections for anyone who's accused of murder. And the evidentiary requirement for premeditated murder has to be very, very high. And that's also, by the way, reflected in Scripture, in the Old Testament law, in terms of how many witnesses are required for this kind of action. I think that God's word itself just affirms the fact that there are crimes and then there are crimes. And there are different consequences for different crimes. And there are victims of crimes and then there are victims. Someone can wantonly take an animal's life. That's very different than premeditated murder of a human being as an image bearer of God. Okay, so that's the capital punishment side. And I think you'll find a lot of classic Christian reasoning based upon the Scripture very consistent with that argument. Then the argument against abortion, the pro-life argument. deeply rooted in Scripture, all the way back in creation order, where every single human being is made in God's image, and that image is to be fully respected. And then thus you ask the question, well, what about an unborn baby? Well, an unborn baby is a human being. As a matter of fact, the biblical theology gives us nowhere to go other than the fact that when the sperm and the egg come together and fertilization takes place, God has said, let there be life. There's a human person there. It's not just potential human life. It is human life. Not every embryo will be born. Not every embryo will go through the full process of development, fetal development, all the way to be born. But that doesn't mean that it's not at every point in that continuum fully human and fully to be respected, with a life to be protected. All right, but there's this very interesting way the question is asked. This young man says, is it possible to defend capital punishment and be against abortion, certainly in a political, legal context, at the same time? And I would say yes, and that has been the consistent position of the Christian church for centuries. But we're in a different context now in which you have some new arguments being made. And so the reason why there are a lot of people who would kind of address the question the way you would address it here is because the Roman Catholic Church, particularly through some of its official teachings, but also through some of its prominent leaders, moved towards what was called a seamless garment understanding of the defense of life, in which you had some people who came out against abortion and against capital punishment. They said, if you're against abortion, you should be against capital punishment. I'm simply going to say I think they were wrong. I'm also going to tell you, just in terms of a calculation, if I could give up capital punishment to gain the protection of every unborn life, I'd be very tempted to take it. I'll just tell you that. I think in the great battle, that's the harder thing. But that's not what's really going on here. I don't think those issues are rightly put together in this so-called seamless garment. I think the Christian church was right for centuries to hold to a very clear biblical understanding. The Bible mandates that capital punishment should be the ultimate sanction for premeditated murder, and that the unborn life is to be protected because of the image of God. As Genesis 9 fully prevails from the moment of fertilization on. All right, great question. And I'll simply say to this young man, I would love to see your senior thesis when you finish it. God bless you. All right, next question, another big question, and it's about parental rights. It's a mother who writes in, and she was listening to my conversation about the Skrmetti decision and the legislation in the state of Tennessee that prohibits transgender treatments for minors. And she asked about the question is related to parental rights. She says she's a mother of four, and she's writing about how conservatives should think about the Supreme Court decision, that's the Skrmetti decision, as it relates to parental rights. She said, I understand the Supreme Court was not being asked to consider the issue of parental rights, but instead was considering whether Tennessee law is a violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. This is a smart mom. She's paying attention. However, she says, the Tennessee law does curtail parental rights. So should a conservative celebrate a Supreme Court decision that upholds the curtailing of parental rights? Okay, great question. I'm going to say that when you look at parental rights, one of the things we as Christians have to ask is how this fits in the larger context. And so let me put it this way. There's not a biblical argument for parents having the right to abuse their child. There's not a biblical argument for parents having the authority to authorize transgender treatments for their children. And you know, this issue of parental rights in medical care is one that's come up for a long time. And honestly, it's been a very difficult thing for the courts to handle. Very close to Louisville here, there have been some famous cases in which parents on their own claimed religious grounds have rejected medical treatment for their children, and sometimes that's to deadly effect. And, you know, there is a process whereby the courts can step in. Parental authority is creation order. It's primary, but in the same way that sometimes the courts have to intervene in a family situation. And in most cases, we would simply have to hope that that would never happen. But we can understand there's some circumstances in which the state would have to come in protection of children. In another sense, the same way, the state has the right to come in protection of children on something basic. And I think that the mother in this case, the listener is asking a very good question. You know, should the government just have the right to pass any legislation along these lines? The answer would be no. And this is where there would have to be a really strong understanding of the imperative to protect young people that would, frankly, either authorize or prohibit certain medical treatments. I also want to say something else, and that is that in every state already there are such laws. So this isn't the first law having to do with minors and medical treatment that might be understood to abridge parental authority. Quite honestly, it's not just the law, by the way. It's not just legal strictures here. You also have medical practice and medical ethics and other things that come in. So good question. I appreciate both of this. One coming from a mom, in this case having to do with parental rights. Parental rights are creation order. Therefore, they are fundamental. And we should fight that parents have the full respect for the authority that is rightfully theirs. But that does not include the authority to allow a surgeon to perform horrifying surgery on a child. Just in closing, we only got these two questions because they're such big questions, but they're both frontline questions. I'm glad we got to look at today. This question about parental rights. The mom goes on to say, well, how long is it before someone claims that children need to be protected from, say a Christian parent's religious influence? Well, there's no way around the fact that if we lose influence in society, if indeed our society turns into a regime totally against parental authority, the religious authority of parents is going to be one of the first things to go. And that's going to be a very, very tragic day if and when that happens. But I will simply say you can already look to some places in the world where it's not hypothetical, it's real. So that's not an unrealistic warning to us all. Glad to receive your questions. Just mail me at mail@albertmohler.com. And glad to hear from all of you. Thankful for all the good questions sent in. Thanks for listening to The Briefing. For more information, go to my website at albertmohler.com. You can follow me on X or Twitter by going to x.com/Albert Mohler. For information on the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, go to sbts.edu. For information on Boyce College, just go to boycecollege.com. I'll meet you again on Monday for The Briefing.